Colleagues, I was given very strict instructions by the session co-chairs to keep it brief so that we could have lots of time to have a group discussion about how we might exchange information and keep abreast of information and knowledge in the future. I also stuck to the title that I was given very closely, so I'm not trying to give my views on what the conclusions of the workshop should be. I'm not trying to give my views on how overall we might keep abreast. I'm going to really give an EU regulator's perspective. And I think I've got 3 slides, so I really am sticking to my mandate. I started by just thinking, what are the established mechanisms for exchanging information and for keeping abreast of this issue? I then asked myself the question, bearing in mind that we're in a workshop which is quite a unique forum, bringing together different stakeholders, what might that lead us to conclude from an EU perspective? So if we go to the next slide. Sorry, it's a slightly dense slide, but just remind ourselves of some of the established, and this is very much an EU focus, some of the established mechanisms where we can keep up abreast of new data arriving, of information for patients, both multiple sclerosis patients, patients with other diseases requiring powerful medicines, as well as individuals who might have suffered important adverse effects of medicines. So if we start thinking about it in the life cycle of a medicine, and I was interested in Dr. Katz's remarks from an earlier session, it is established on both sides of the Atlantic, my focus is Europe, that the regulators will give advice on clinical development. Now that might be the role of a biomarker. It might be validation of that biomarker. And in fact, there's a very nice pilot project already established between the European Medicines Agency and the Food and Drug Administration, where in parallel, companies submit to the 2 organizations a biomarker for validation. There's then a dialogue between the regulators on both sides of the Atlantic, and we give feedback and, if you like, a judgment on whether this might be a valid biomarker for clinical development. So quite a nice link in there with our transatlantic theme today. Clinical trials development is bread and butter for medicines regulators, and we call it scientific advice on this side of the Atlantic. It's called different things on the other side of the Atlantic, but companies come, they pose questions to the regulators on how a medicinal product might be tested in clinical trials. It might be to demonstrate efficacy, it might be to demonstrate safety, and the regulators would then give specific and detailed advice on the clinical trial program. Collection and assessment of all data relevant to the benefits and risks of medicines that are already authorized. This very much tallies with Gerald Alpan's presentation from earlier today, where we talked about the different ways of collecting information, be it routine, be it active surveillance, be it drug utilization, etc. This is something that we as regulators, working with the industry and with other stakeholder groups, have to do, should do. It's really our bread and butter job. In addition to that sort of collection of information, we also place obligations on the marketing authorization holders to conduct studies. This might be mechanistic studies, laboratory studies, preclinical studies, might be epidemiological studies or further clinical trials. This again is a normal way of gathering further information, filling knowledge gaps and sharing information, particularly between regulators and the industry. We also enforce obligations. There's very important obligations in our European law, which is an obligation on the industry to share with the regulators any information, be it from whatever source, including clinical trials in an unauthorized indication, to share that information with the regulators if it might impact on the benefits and risks of the medicines. And clearly that's a very important way in our established armamentarium as a regulator of making sure that we get relevant information so that we can make regulatory decisions for the benefits of public health protection and promotion. We had a lot of discussion yesterday about information for patients, and I don't think we've solved all of the challenges in this workshop, but I think it really is up there on the agenda. And I think it is well established that we need to optimize product information for healthcare professionals and for patients, and that would include the patient information leaflets for specific products. There's been a lot of focus on 1 or 2 products in this meeting, but clearly progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, difficult to explain, difficult to describe in terms of benefits and risks of these products, and what we need to be aiming for is information to support decision-making by patients and healthcare professionals. And that is established in our working practice as European regulators. I also wanted to highlight transparency, because this is an area where the regulators have already made a lot of progress. Some would say we've made too much progress. Some would say we haven't made enough progress, but there's no doubt we've made a lot of progress. And it's also no doubt that we're going to make a lot more progress in the years to come, based partly on the new pharmacovigilance legislation, but partly on legislation on access to documents, which is sort of freedom of information type legislation in Europe, which is being implemented now and will grant very, very high levels of access to data submitted to the medicines regulatory agencies. It's very much about transparency, and I think it's an important distinction, because it probably won't be made available, certainly in the first steps, in ways that will really support decision-making by stakeholders, unless people really know what they're looking for. It's about availability of information rather than decision support, I suppose. But just a few examples. Clinical trials information. Only very recently at a European level have we given access to the clinical trials database, including clinical trials results. Adverse reaction data at a European level is not routinely made public, but it is in our work plan for the coming months to start making adverse reaction data available from the eurovigilance database. Non-interventional studies, we launched a few months ago a new database particularly focused on transparency of protocols and results for non-interventional studies, the NCEP database, which Henry Fitt told you about today. All important transparency initiatives. If we go to the next slide. Now, I presented that all as bread and butter, what we're doing already, and I think largely it was all bread and butter, what we're doing already. Just a few thoughts about that have come to us in terms of this workshop. Well, here we are. I mean, this is an innovative way of working and of bringing the key stakeholders together, and we've had some very frank and open exchanges of views on progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy, the knowledge that we have, the knowledge gaps, and how we might address those. We've also talked quite a lot today about fostering collaboration and fostering capacity building. And capacity building is about networking, it's about sharing information, it's about sharing best practice, and it's about tackling obstacles. I was struck by the colleague talking about lots of lawyers about and intellectual property. These are the sort of things that if you don't tackle them, they become an obstacle to progress. And however difficult sometimes they are, you have to deal with them head on. Funding, law, governance, we have to tackle these obstacles to make things better. Regulators can consider and potentially endorse a PML research agenda, and Anna Hidalgo this morning, first presentation this morning, presented to you our draft research agenda developed by the regulators going into this meeting. And finally, regulators can support the dissemination of research agendas to funding bodies, and we hope that by having input from multiple stakeholders and explicit support from regulatory bodies on both sides of the Atlantic, such research agendas may be very powerful in terms of leveraging funding opportunities in the future. So if we go to the last slide. This workshop has been about identifying what we know and what we don't know. We think that by ensuring that a research agenda is disseminated, we can make an impact on progressive multifocal leukoencephalopathy and improve the balance of risks and benefits for patients needing powerful medicines. So that would be my perspective, gentlemen, for going forward. Thank you very much.